She walked into the dealership in a pair of jeans and a plain white t-shirt, looking for a luxury car. The salesman gave her a once-over, his expression full of judgment. "I'm sorry, but I think you're in the wrong place," he said with a smirk, gesturing toward the exit. "These cars start at $300,000. Some of the other employees chuckled, and a few customers stared. Embarrassed but silent, she turned and left. The next morning, a stunning Rolls Royce Phantom rolled up outside the same dealership. When the back door opened, the salesman's mouth fell open. He never saw it coming. Boston luxury motors gleamed under the morning sun. The dealership's glass walls displayed a lineup of high-end cars: Porsche, Bentley, Aston Martin, Ferrari, each more extravagant than the last. Margaret Collins, known as Maggie to those close to her, stepped inside. Her brown ponytail bounced slightly with each step. She wore the same white t-shirt and jeans, her face free of heavy makeup. At 35, she carried herself with the confidence of a woman who knew exactly who she was. What no one could tell just by looking at her was that Maggie was the founder and driving force behind the Collins Foundation for Children with Disabilities. She had spent years building the organization from the ground up, dedicating her education in special needs development to making a real difference in thousands of young lives. As she walked through the showroom, her eyes landed on a sleek midnight blue coupe, perfect for her sister's 40th birthday. Caroline had always dreamed of owning a luxury car, and after overcoming breast cancer last year, Maggie wanted to give her something truly special. Money wasn't an issue. Her foundation's success, along with her personal investments, had made her financially comfortable, though few people knew it. Across the showroom, Blake Thompson adjusted his blue tie and straightened his navy suit jacket. As the sales manager, he prided himself on spotting serious buyers instantly. One look at Maggie's casual clothes, and he was already dismissing her. Smirking, he nodded toward his colleagues. "This would be entertaining." "Good morning." Maggie greeted a young salesman named Daniel as he approached her. "Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors. I'm Daniel. Is there something specific you're looking for today?" Before Maggie could answer, Blake smoothly cut in. "I'll take it from here, Daniel," he said, then turned to Maggie with a forced smile. "Looking for directions, ma'am?" And just like that, Maggie's visit to the dealership had begun, a visit that would challenge everyone's assumptions. "Actually," she replied, her tone pleasant, "I'm interested in that midnight blue coupe." She pointed toward the $285,000 vehicle showcased on an elevated platform. Blake's smile tightened. He had seen this before, people wandering in just to fantasize about cars they could never afford. With the end-of-month quotas approaching and 3 serious buyers scheduled for later, he had no patience for daydreamers. "That's the limited edition Azure. Only 15 were made this year," he said slowly, as if explaining to a child. "Perhaps I could direct you to our pre-owned section. It's in a separate building about 3 blocks east." Maggie noticed his gaze flicking over her outfit, lingering on her slightly scuffed sneakers. She remained calm, but inside, she knew exactly how this was going to play out. Maggie was used to these kinds of judgments. Most people had no idea that she deliberately chose a simple lifestyle, despite having access to immense wealth. She valued freedom and simplicity over extravagance. "I'd really like to learn more about this one," she said politely. "Is it possible to see the interior?" Blake's expression soured. Behind him, 2 salesmen exchanged knowing glances. "The Azure is by appointment only," he lied smoothly. "Our serious clients typically schedule private viewings." Just then, a well-dressed couple entered the showroom. Blake's entire demeanor changed in an instant. "Please excuse me," he said to Maggie without actually looking at her. "Why don't you take a brochure? Daniel can help you with that." He strode toward the couple, arms outstretched in welcome. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrington. Wonderful to see you again." Daniel, the younger salesman, stepped up to Maggie with an apologetic smile. He looked no older than 25, and his suit seemed a size too big. "I'm sorry about that," he said quietly. "Would you like me to tell you about the Azure?" "I would, thank you," Maggie replied as Daniel enthusiastically described the vehicle's features. Maggie couldn't help but notice Blake leading the well-dressed couple directly to the Azure. He opened the door with a flourish, inviting Mrs. Harrington to sit inside. The same car he had just claimed was, by appointment only. "That's quite all right," Maggie assured the now uncomfortable Daniel. "I understand how these things work. Across the showroom, Blake was in full salesman mode. "This particular model has a waiting list of 8 months, he told the Harringtons, but I've set aside one for special clients." Mrs. Harrington ran her hand along the leather interior. "It's exquisite, but I'm not sure about the color." "We could certainly discuss custom options," Blake assured her. Maggie stepped closer, standing just within earshot. "Excuse me," she said. "I was hoping to inquire about purchasing this model." Blake's face tightened. "As I mentioned earlier, this vehicle is being shown to these customers," he said, barely concealing his irritation. "Perhaps you could come back another time, or, as I suggested, check our used car options." The couple glanced uncomfortably between Blake and Maggie. "I'm specifically interested in this car," Maggie stated calmly. "For my sister's birthday next month." Blake stepped away from the Harringtons, lowering his voice. "Look, I understand people like to dream, but this is a place of business. That vehicle costs more than most homes. Now, I've been patient, but you're interrupting a legitimate sale." Several nearby customers had stopped to watch the uncomfortable exchange. Daniel hovered anxiously on the sidelines. "I'm prepared to make a cash purchase today," Maggie said, her tone steady. That was when Blake's professional facade completely cracked. He let out a short, harsh laugh that echoed across the showroom floor. Several heads turned. "A cash purchase? Really?" His voice was louder now, designed to humiliate. "This isn't a yard sale. We're talking about $250,000, Blake scoffed. "People who can afford these cars don't dress like," he gestured dismissively at her outfit. Maggie felt her cheeks warm, not from embarrassment, but from a slow, simmering anger. Not for herself, she had dealt with this kind of treatment before, but for anyone who had ever been judged by their appearance. "I believe my money is as good as anyone else's," she said quietly. Blake stepped closer, towering over her. "Let me be clear," he said, dropping all pretense of politeness. "You are wasting my time and embarrassing yourself. Either make an appointment for a serious discussion, dressed appropriately, or please leave the premises." The showroom had fallen silent. Even the Harringtons had stepped away from the car, clearly uncomfortable. "Is there a problem here?" A new voice cut through the tension. The dealership's owner, Richard Mason, had been drawn over by the commotion. Blake straightened his tie, suddenly all professionalism. "No problem, sir," he said smoothly. "Just explaining to this lady that we operate by appointment for serious buyers." Richard Mason took in the scene, Maggie's simple clothing, the watching crowd. His expression made it clear which side he was on. "I see," he said. "Ms. Collins." "Maggie," she supplied. "Margaret Collins." "Ms. Collins, perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. Our clientele typically, well, they understand the exclusivity of our vehicles." "I understand perfectly," Maggie replied, her voice steady despite the sting of humiliation. "Your sales manager has made your policies quite clear." Blake stepped forward again, his tone dripping with condescension. "If you're genuinely interested, which I doubt, you can call for an appointment. But I'd suggest bringing proof of funds and dressing the part. These cars," he gestured around the showroom, "are for a certain class of people." A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Someone snickered. Maggie glanced around at the judgmental faces, at Blake's smug expression, at the owner's silent approval of his employees' behavior. She had faced discrimination before, but rarely so blatantly, so publicly. "I see," she said simply. Her dignity remained intact, but her spirit was bruised. She turned and walked toward the exit. Behind her, she heard Blake mutter, just loud enough to be heard, "Some people just don't know their place." As she stepped through the glass doors into the bright morning light, Maggie pulled out her phone. The humiliation stung, but a small, determined smile formed on her lips as she dialed. The Collins estate sat on 5 quiet acres outside Boston, its understated elegance revealing nothing of the billions behind its ownership. Alexander Collins preferred it that way. At 41, the tech visionary had revolutionized renewable energy storage technology, amassing a fortune while maintaining a deliberately low profile. When Maggie entered his home office, Alexander immediately looked up from his desk, setting his work aside. 15 years of marriage had taught him to read her expressions with precision. Something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked, moving around the desk to meet her. Maggie sank into a leather chair, the morning's events washing over her again. It was educational, she said with a wry smile that didn't reach her eyes. She recounted the experience at the dealership, the condescension, the humiliation, the blatant discrimination. As she spoke, Alexander's expression darkened, but he remained silent, giving her space to process. "It's not about me," she concluded. "I have the privilege of walking away, knowing the truth. But how many people are treated that way every day, without the comfort of knowing they actually could afford what they're being denied?" Alexander nodded thoughtfully. In all their years together, this was what had always moved him most about Maggie, her unwavering concern for others, even when she herself had been wronged. "So," he asked, "what would you like to do about it?" "Finally, part of me wants to do nothing," Maggie admitted. "Just buy Caroline's gift elsewhere. But then I think about that young salesman, Daniel, who treated me with respect regardless of how I was dressed. And I think about all the people who face that kind of judgment without having any recourse." She looked directly at Alexander. "These people need to understand that worth isn't determined by appearance. But I don't want vengeance, I want awareness." Alexander nodded slowly, a plan forming in his mind. "I think I might have an idea that accomplishes both." "Nothing too dramatic," Maggie warned, knowing her husband's protective instincts. "No buying the dealership and firing everyone." Alexander laughed. "Nothing so cliché. But maybe." He leaned forward, eyes twinkling. "A little education is in order." Together, they crafted a plan, not for revenge, but for enlightenment. Something that might change perspectives more effectively than simple retribution. "Are you sure you don't want to come along?" Alexander asked when they had finalized the details. Maggie shook her head. "This isn't about me needing to witness their comeuppance. It's about them learning to see beyond appearances." She paused, then added with a smile, "But I expect a full report." As evening settled over their home, Alexander made several phone calls, setting things in motion for the following morning. Tomorrow would bring a powerful lesson in humility and the danger of assumptions, not just for Blake Thompson, but for everyone at Boston Luxury Motors. The following morning arrived with picture-perfect weather. Blake Thompson entered Boston Luxury Motors with a confident stride, straightening his signature blue tie. Yesterday's incident with the underdressed woman had become an amusing anecdote he had shared over drinks with colleagues. Just another delusional dreamer thinking she belonged in the world of luxury. The showroom gleamed under carefully positioned lights, exotic cars arranged strategically to maximize their allure. Blake had just finished the morning staff meeting, emphasizing the importance of qualifying customers properly. "Remember," he had instructed the sales team, "our time is valuable. We cater to a specific clientele. It's not elitism, it's efficiency." Daniel, the young salesman, had remained quiet during the meeting, his discomfort evident. Blake made a mental note to have a word with him about proper customer assessment. At precisely 10:17 a.m., the distinctive purr of an exceptional engine drew attention outside. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, a vehicle unlike any other glided to a stop directly in front of the main entrance. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Even Blake, typically unimpressed by luxury vehicles given his daily proximity to them, felt his pulse quicken. Rolls Royce Phantom extended wheelbase. But not just any Phantom, this was a custom model with a unique midnight blue finish that seemed to shift colors in the sunlight. Conservative estimates would place its value north of $1.2 million. "Is that?" Richard Mason, the owner, had emerged from his office, drawn by the sudden silence. "The bespoke Phantom," Blake confirmed, already moving toward the entrance. "Extremely rare configuration." A uniformed chauffeur exited the Rolls-Royce and walked around to open the rear passenger door with white-gloved precision. From the vehicle emerged a man of commanding presence, tall, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that whispered rather than shouted its five-figure price tag. His salt-and-pepper hair was perfectly groomed, his posture effortlessly authoritative. Blake's salesman instincts kicked into overdrive. This was beyond a good prospect. This was the kind of client dealerships competed for. The kind whose purchases included not just one vehicle but potentially an ongoing relationship worth millions. "Good morning, sir. Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors," Blake called out, intercepting the distinguished visitor before any other salesperson could approach. "Blake Thompson, sales manager. It's an absolute pleasure to have you with us today." The man regarded Blake with an unreadable expression, then offered a polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Alexander Collins," he replied simply, offering a firm handshake. Blake's mind raced. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't immediately place it. Regardless, the priority was clear. This was a client who demanded the utmost attention. The presence of the Rolls Royce alone made it clear that this man was someone of considerable wealth. Blake immediately put on his most polished sales persona. "Mr. Collins, what an absolute pleasure. What brings you to our dealership today? Perhaps I could show you some of our latest arrivals? We just received a limited edition." Alexander raised a hand slightly, cutting off Blake's well-rehearsed pitch. "Actually, I'm here for a specific car, the Azure Coupe, Midnight Blue." Blake's smile widened. "An excellent choice, sir. Only 15 of these were produced this year. I'd be delighted to show it to you." "It's actually right over." "I know where it is," Alexander interrupted smoothly. "My wife was here yesterday, expressing interest in it." For the first time, Blake hesitated. "Your wife? I don't recall. Perhaps one of my colleagues assisted her." Alexander's expression cooled. "No, Mr. Thompson. You assisted her, or rather, you refused to. Margaret Collins. She was wearing jeans and a white t-shirt. You suggested she might be more comfortable looking at used cars." The color drained from Blake's face as realization struck. Behind him, Daniel, the young salesman, let out a quiet gasp. "Mr. Collins, Blake stammered, his usual smooth confidence faltering. "There must be some misunderstanding. We welcome all customers here." By now, Richard Mason, the dealership's owner, had arrived, sensing that something serious was unfolding. "Is there a problem here?" he asked, his sharp gaze shifting between Blake and the distinguished visitor. Alexander turned to face him. "Mr. Mason, I presume?" Richard nodded. "Yes, I'm Richard Mason. Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors." "Thank you," Alexander said evenly. "I was just explaining to Mr. Thompson that my wife visited yesterday, interested in purchasing the Azure Coupe as a gift for her sister. However, she was treated in a way I find unacceptable." Richard's welcoming expression quickly faded into concern. I'm sorry to hear that. I was briefly involved in that conversation, but I wasn't aware of all the details." Alexander's voice remained calm, but firm. "The details include your sales manager here assuming that my wife didn't belong in this dealership simply because of her appearance. He dismissed her without even considering that she was a serious buyer." A heavy silence settled over the showroom. Employees, customers, and support staff had all stopped to listen. Blake's face was pale. "Mr. Collins, if there was any misunderstanding, it wasn't a misunderstanding." All eyes turned to Daniel, who looked surprised at his own boldness. Mrs. Collins was treated unfairly. She was polite and clear about her interest in the Azure, but she was ignored and dismissed because of how she was dressed. Blake shot Daniel a sharp glare, but the damage had already been done. Alexander turned back to Richard Mason. "It's interesting," he said thoughtfully. "My wife founded and runs the Collins Foundation for Children with Disabilities. It has been her life's work for years. Through her efforts, she has raised over $50 million for medical equipment and educational programs." The weight of that number settled over the room. "Maggie chooses to dress simply because she believes in living modestly, despite our financial means. She feels it keeps her connected to the families she helps. It's one of the countless reasons I love her." Richard Mason looked visibly uncomfortable. "Mr. Collins, I assure you, this does not reflect the values of our dealership. We take pride in treating every customer with respect." Alexander's gaze didn't waver. "Actions speak louder than mission statements, Mr. Mason. Now, about the Azure, I'm not here to buy just one." Blake's interest peaked slightly at this, a glimmer of professional hope breaking through his distress. "I had planned to purchase the Azure for my wife's sister, just as Maggie intended," Alexander continued. "But I was also considering replacing our corporate fleet, 7 vehicles in total. And my personal collection could use some updating as well." Richard Mason's eyes widened. A sale of that size would meet their quarterly targets in a single transaction. But before he could respond, Alexander added, "However, I'm now questioning whether this is the right dealership for such a significant investment." The room went silent. Blake's face turned pale. "Mr. Collins," Richard said quickly, his voice filled with urgency, "I cannot apologize enough for this unfortunate incident. Please believe me when I say this is not how we conduct business. Allow us the opportunity to make this right." Alexander considered this for a moment before replying. "There may be a way forward, but it requires more than just selling me cars." "Anything," Richard assured him. "The Collins Foundation is hosting a benefit gala next month," Alexander explained. "We're raising funds for a new adaptive sports complex for children with physical disabilities." He then turned to Blake. "I think your presence there would be educational." Blake swallowed hard. "Sir." "Not as a guest," Alexander clarified. "As a volunteer. The foundation always needs people to help with setup, assist the children, and see firsthand the impact of our work." The message was clear. This wasn't about a business transaction anymore. It was about learning a valuable lesson in human decency. Alexander then addressed Richard Mason again. "Additionally, I'd recommend implementing a training program on unconscious bias for your staff. I know some excellent consultants." Richard nodded emphatically. "Absolutely. We'd welcome such an initiative." "As for the vehicles," Alexander said, shifting his attention to Daniel, the young salesman who had spoken up on Maggie's behalf, "I'd like you to handle all the paperwork, starting with the Azure for my sister-in-law." Daniel's eyes widened. "Me? Thank you, sir. I'd be honored." "Good," Alexander said with finality. "Now, shall we discuss the specifics of the corporate fleet?" As they moved toward Mason's office, Alexander paused in front of the Azure, running his hand along its sleek contours. "My wife has excellent taste, doesn't she?" Behind them, Blake Thompson stood motionless. His carefully constructed world had been fundamentally altered. He now understood the harsh reality. Character is not revealed in how you treat the wealthy and powerful, but in how you treat those you assume are unimportant. 1 month later, the Collins Foundation Benefit Gala transformed the Grand Boston Hotel into a celebration of hope and possibility. Children with various disabilities and their families mingled with donors, medical professionals, and supporters. Near the entrance, Blake Thompson, dressed not in his usual high-end suit, but in an event staff uniform, greeted guests and assisted a young boy in a wheelchair. The past month had changed him profoundly. What had begun as an obligation, a professional necessity, had turned into something unexpected. As he witnessed the daily challenges these children faced, and the dignity with which they faced them, his perspective had shifted. Across the room, Maggie Collins, elegant in a simple blue dress, approached him. Though he now knew exactly who she was, Blake was again struck by her humility and lack of pretense. "How are you finding the experience, Blake?" she asked. He took a moment before answering, choosing his words carefully. "Humbling. And necessary." Maggie nodded. "Thomas seems to have taken a liking to you," she observed, referring to the young boy in the wheelchair. "He's teaching me about adaptive basketball," Blake admitted with a small smile. "Apparently, I have terrible form." Maggie chuckled. "He's an honest coach." Blake's expression grew serious. "Mrs. Collins, I know I've apologized formally, but I need to say it to you directly. I am truly sorry for how I treated you." "There's no excuse." "You're right," she agreed, though there was no malice in her tone. "The real question is, what have you learned?" Blake met her gaze. "That worth isn't determined by appearance, status, or wealth," he said thoughtfully. "And that everyone deserves respect, until they prove otherwise. Not the other way around." Maggie smiled. "Good lessons." "Expensive ones too," Blake admitted, thinking about the costly mistake that had led him here. But as he watched Thomas demonstrate a basketball move nearby, for the first time in a long time, Blake felt like he had gained something truly valuable. The business loss for Boston Luxury Motors was undeniable when Alexander Collins chose to buy only the Azure and not the additional fleet of vehicles. But for him, the lesson was worth every penny. "Absolutely worth it," Alexander said sincerely. Across the room, Maggie Collins stood with Blake Thompson, who had just finished sharing his thoughts on the past month. Alexander approached and placed a hand on his wife's shoulder. "I hear you've become quite involved with the adaptive sports program," he said, looking at Blake. "Yes, sir. Actually, I've decided to keep volunteering even after my required time is up," Blake admitted. He hesitated for a moment before adding, "I've also been working with Mr. Mason to change how we approach customers at the dealership." No more judging people by how they look. Alexander nodded approvingly. Good to hear. That corporate fleet I mentioned, we're still in the market. Maybe you'd like to handle that transaction? Daniel speaks highly of your mentorship. Blake was momentarily stunned before his expression shifted to genuine gratitude. Mr. Collins, I'd be honored. Truly honored. Later that evening, as the event wound down, Blake watched as Alexander and Maggie moved through the room, not as a wealthy power couple flaunting their influence, but as two people genuinely connecting with each child and family. It struck him just how much his perspective had changed. A month ago, he would have dismissed someone like Maggie based on her casual attire. Now, he understood that real worth had nothing to do with designer labels, expensive cars, or titles. As he helped Thomas back into his wheelchair after a photo session, the young boy grinned up at him. You know what, Mr. Blake? You're pretty cool for a grown-up. Blake smiled. Coming from you, Thomas, that's the best compliment I've gotten in a long time. And he meant it. We all make snap judgments based on appearances, don't we? But as Blake Thompson learned, looking beyond the surface can lead to incredible people and life-changing experiences. If this story resonated with you, hit that subscribe button and become part of our storytelling community. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever misjudged someone based on their looks, or been misjudged yourself? Your story might inspire someone else. And remember, true wealth isn't measured by what's in your bank account. It's measured by how you treat others, especially when you think no one important is watching. See you in our next story, where another powerful lesson awaits.